The end of Cuba marked a significant turning point in Russell Bufalino's life. He had the distinction of having the final take from the Havana casino, totaling a substantial $450,000. With a sense of loyalty to his Cuban contacts, he handed over this fortune and made his escape, never expecting to see those funds again. Unbeknownst to him, two of his associates had siphoned off around $300,000 from the casino's proceeds. Bufalino only discovered this later, and it infuriated him. Russell Bufalino was not one to tolerate theft within the mob, and the missing $300,000 tarnished his reputation. This incident reached the ears of certain individuals linked to the CIA who saw an opportunity. They approached Bufalino, seeking his assistance in leveraging his Cuban connections and the money to gather intelligence out of Cuba. Specifically, they were interested in understanding the routes Fidel Castro and his associates used to access certain beaches. The Mafia's involvement with the CIA dated back to the 50s, and they wanted Bufalino to employ the funds to support a propaganda campaign. However, Russell was taken aback when he stumbled upon the details of this arrangement in Time magazine. He was not pleased with his name being publicly associated with such activities. With the House Select Committee on Assassinations, HSCA hearings on the horizon, he was determined to avoid any further unwanted attention. Giancana, Roselli, and Hoffa, all known contacts of the CIA, met tragic ends. Yet Russell Bufalino managed to remain untouched, despite his unease with seeing his name in print. He suspected that someone close to him might be leaking information to the press or authorities. A few weeks before the Teamster offices were raided, Russell realized he could no longer delay a difficult decision. He needed to address the Jimmy Hoffa situation. In the annals of organized crime, the intertwining sagas of the Bufalino family, the Scarfo family, and the baffling disappearance of James R. Hoffa have left an indelible mark on the criminal underworld. Unlike other mobsters, Russell Bufalino managed to survive the aftermath of the 1957 Appalachian disaster, where his name was brought up numerous times. His role in helping each man get off the charges made it clear to the authorities that Bufalino was extremely powerful and heavily connected. From that point until 1960, Bufalino was under intense scrutiny, facing both legal and immigration issues. He survived it all and continued to operate despite the government's increasing efforts to combat organized crime. Bufalino's resilience was evident up until 1963, even as he navigated the war on organized crime. Notably, Bufalino and Angelo Bruno were caught on wiretaps discussing the Kennedy problem months before President Kennedy's assassination. Although Bufalino did not respond to Bruno's remarks, the FBI later realized this silence indicated that Bufalino was already considering drastic actions. The disappearance of Jimmy Hoffa in 1975 further cemented Bufalino's notoriety. His name was forever linked to Hoffa's disappearance, triggering intense efforts by the FBI, IRS, Justice Department, and other agencies to imprison him. Authorities were even willing to use the Al Capone method, charging him with any crime they could to ensure a conviction. The media also intensified its scrutiny, with the Philadelphia Inquirer targeting Bufalino in January 1979, gradually exposing his dangerous influence and power. Bufalino operated behind closed doors, maintaining connections with the biggest players in organized crime. He was associated with figures like Sam Giancana, the Trafficante crime family, Jimmy Blue Eyes, Alo, Meyer Lansky, Carlos Marcello in New Orleans, Joe Zerilli in Detroit, and many others. He had significant ties to casino operations in Las Vegas, the Bahamas, and other locations, as well as connections to all 5 New York crime families. Bufalino was also linked to Stefano Magaddino and was a close associate of Vito Genovese. As the boss of the Bufalino family, Bufalino's influence extended beyond his own organization. At various times, he was known to have taken charge of the Genovese and Anastasia families. When Albert Anastasia died, Bufalino briefly took the helm of what later became the Gambino family. His ability to lead and be respected in such powerful crime families demonstrated his significant influence and capability. When Vito Genovese was imprisoned without having appointed a successor, Bufalino stepped in to lead the Genovese crime family. This family had a storied history, having evolved from the Masseria and Maranzano families to the Luciano and Costello families before becoming the Genovese family. Bufalino's leadership during this transitional period highlighted his remarkable competence and power. However, by 1979, Bufalino's reign began to unravel. The first articles exposing his extensive criminal history started to emerge, gradually revealing the full scope of his activities and connections. The public learned of his deep involvement in organized crime and his significant influence over various crime families and illegal operations. Pennsylvania's leading mobster. His rise and fall. Russell Bufalino has retired from his various businesses, which federal authorities say have included loan sharking, gambling, diamond and silver smuggling, fencing stolen goods, and labor racketeering. Like other retirees, he is living in Florida, but with a catch. For the first time in his life, he is in jail. By Mike Leary, Inquirer staff writer. For Russell Bufalino, the aging boss of organized crime in the hardscrabble coal country of northeastern Pennsylvania, and one of the most powerful mobsters in the country, it was to be the last extended trip south. As a lawyer for Bufalino explained to a case officer for the U.S. Immigration and Naturalization Service almost a year ago, it would just be a journey down to Bufalino's winter villa in Hollywood, Florida, a suburb of Miami, where he was going to get a little sea and sun. The case officer's approval was necessary because Bufalino, who was born in Sicily, had been declared an undocumented immigrant, and the government was still trying unsuccessfully to deport him. At 75, Bufalino, a stumpy, swarthy man with glaring hazel eyes, 2 fingers missing on his left hand, and a nasty, gleaming white scar on his right temple, was thinking about possible relocation in Florida, or so his attorney told the case officer. Bufalino had, the lawyer claimed, retired from his various businesses, which federal authorities say have included loan sharking, gambling, diamond and silver smuggling, fencing stolen goods, and labor racketeering. His health was failing, the lawyer said. The old man had diabetes, was blind in his right eye from an accident in his youth, suffered back spasms, and had a heart attack 5 years earlier. Bufalino got the approval for the Florida trip and left last January 20th. It was to be his last hurrah. Florida is where he is today, although under circumstances not of his choosing. He is in jail for the first time in his life, serving 4 years on a 1977 federal extortion conviction after having exhausted all of his appeals. The U.S. Supreme Court recently refused to hear his final appeal. Who is this man, Russell Bufalino, and how did he manage to stay out of prison all those years? And why is he now, at last, imprisoned at 75? Perhaps the best way to answer those questions is to focus on that Florida trip last winter. Although Bufalino received routine approval for the trip, it later developed that he was telling his case officer somewhat less than the full story about his plans. And they did not seem to have much to do with his health. Things had gotten a little uncomfortable in January up in Kingston, a Wilkes-Barre suburb where Bufalino lives in a modest home across from a Little League baseball field. A federal grand jury had begun an investigation based on revelations made during the controversy over the firing of David Marston as U.S. Attorney for Eastern Pennsylvania. It was asking questions about Bufalino's good friends and erstwhile business associates, the Medicos, who own Medico Industries, Inc., one of Wilkes-Barre's major businesses. The jury was wondering why the local congressman, Daniel J. Flood, had worked so diligently to win about $60 million worth of government defense contracts for Medico Industries, and whether the firm had ties to organized crime. Bufalino's name had popped up publicly in connection with the investigation. And Bufalino did know Flood, having once told an immigration hearing, "I have had dinner with him." The Medico investigation did not yield an indictment. Flood has been indicted on influence peddling charges unrelated to that probe. But the main reason for Bufalino's January trip to Florida, federal sources now say, was to help arrange a national meeting of mob leaders to discuss burgeoning problems with law enforcement agencies, including a federal grand jury inquiry into alleged payoffs to longshoremen in big East Coast ports and how to blunt the investigations. The meetings, held inside a closed-up Miami Beach restaurant and outside on the beach near the Fontainebleau Hotel, took place February 18th and 19, according to federal sources. The top mobsters, about 24 of them, separately checked into numerous hotels around South Florida, apparently to confuse and disperse watching federal agents before the actual meeting. One of the delegates was said by federal officials to be Bufalino's old friend, Angelo Bruno of Philadelphia. Bufalino used to talk regularly on the telephone to Bruno until he discovered that the FBI was wiretapping him. Biggest since 1957. The February meeting in Miami Beach has since been described by law enforcement sources as one of the biggest since the famed 1957 mob gathering at the rustic Appalachian, New York, home of the late Joseph Mario Barbara Sr., a convicted bootlegger suspected of at least 3 murders, and the man whom Bufalino succeeded as boss of the Northeast Pennsylvania mob. Appalachian is just above the Pennsylvania state line. Bufalino at that time was Barbara's sottocapo, or underboss, and it was Bufalino who was reputed to have made the arrangements for the Appalachian meeting. Asked questions about it later under oath, he invoked his Fifth Amendment privilege against self-incrimination. According to a report prepared by New York State investigators, Bufalino arrived at the meeting in a car owned by William Medico of Medico Industries. It was the Appalachian meeting, broken up by New York State Police, that first focused national attention on Bufalino. The Miami Beach meeting last February may well have been the last. On August 10th, after legal attempts to overturn his extortion conviction failed and his $50,000 bail was revoked, he surrendered to U.S. Marshals and went to prison, first in New York, then in Connecticut, and now in Florida. His sentence was 4 years in prison, followed by 5 years probation. He was fined $20,000. So Bufalino, now known as prisoner 09693-158, has been behind bars since August, with the exception of a 2-day furlough in early September. The furlough was granted so that he could spend his 50th wedding anniversary with his wife, Carolyn. He was going to throw a big party at a downtown Wilkes Bar restaurant, but at the last moment, he decided not to, fearing that reporters would harass him. Once again, Bufalino was big news. 2 new books on the Teamsters Union had just been published, and their most sensational allegation was that it was Bufalino who had ordered the murder of Teamster boss James Riddle Hoffa, who vanished in 1975. The controversial claim, yet to be fully documented or proven, has gained currency because of Bufalino's friendship with the chief suspect in Hoffa's disappearance, Anthony Tony Provenzano, a North Jersey Teamster official now imprisoned on another murder conviction. Provenzano kept a winter home in Hallandale, Florida, not far from Bufalino's villa. An added factor was that Bufalino's cousin, William Bufalino, is both a Detroit Teamster official and an attorney who has represented a number of suspects in the Hoffa disappearance. William Bufalino was a spectator at Cousin Russell's extortion trial. Bufalino is known to dislike unfavorable publicity. It has, he once said, made a lot of small-minded people think I've got the plague. They just walk away. He likes to think of himself, as a federal sentencing report put it, as an old, compassionate, generous person who lives modestly. During his 50-year crime career, Bufalino, although prosecuted numerous times, had been convicted of nothing more serious than a traffic violation and a couple of minor gambling infractions until 2 years ago. But things fell apart for Bufalino in one short minute, on April 12, 1976. The scene was the Vesuvio restaurant in the Broadway Theatre district in Manhattan. Bufalino often traveled to New York, and he could usually be found at the Vesuvio, where he would eat and confer with business associates at darkened back tables. On this particular day, disguised FBI agents unobtrusively snapped pictures from across the street as a small-time crook named Jack Napoli, a miniature Nagra brand tape recorder taped to his chest, walked into the restaurant. Napoli was an FBI informer. A little persuasion. In February, Napoli, using the alias of Jack Caringhi, had audaciously persuaded a Manhattan jeweler named Herbie Jacobs to sell him $11,000 worth of diamonds, invoking the name of his good friend, Russell Bufalino. He had little difficulty persuading Jacobs to take his checks, since, federal authorities say, Bufalino had often supplied Jacobs with stolen and smuggled diamonds to fence, and probably had a hidden financial interest in the business. This was a very foolish thing for Napoli to do, however, since he did not actually know Bufalino, and since the checks he wrote were drawn on the bank account of a defunct company. When the checks bounced, Herbie Jacobs decided to call up Bufalino and ask him about his friend. Bufalino, naturally, was very unhappy that his name had been so invoked. In fact, Jacobs would later tell Napoli, "If he had you here, he would throw you out the window." Napoli was not very difficult to track down, and soon he began getting not very subtle suggestions from friends of Bufalino that he had better return the diamonds and repay the money, or else he might die. One Bufalino henchman, Michael Sparber, told Napoli's wife that her 3 children would be killed first, then she would be killed, and finally her husband. Napoli decided to tell his story to the FBI, face to face. And on April 12th, Bufalino and Napoli were to meet face to face inside the Vesuvio. "You motherfucker," snarled Bufalino, spotting Napoli soon after he entered the restaurant. "One of these days, you know, you're going to allow me to do things I never did in my life." "You're mad at me, right?" asked Napoli, still quite brash. "Because you're a—" roared Bufalino, gesticulating. "And if you're don't do the right thing, I'm going to kill you. And I'm going to do it myself, and I'm going to go to jail, just for you. You are big. You have no reason to do this, what you did." To emphasize the point, Bufalino angrily kicked Napoli in the groin. Napoli staggered out of the restaurant. Later that day, the tape was turned over to the FBI. Bufalino was indicted under a federal extortion statute, charged with using extortionate means involving the use of express and implicit threats of the use of violence against Jack Napoli in order to collect and attempt to collect from Napoli extensions of credit made by Herbert Jacobs. I am innocent. Bufalino was finished, but unrepentant. At his sentencing, he told U.S. District Judge Morris E. Lasker, "I am innocent," but the judge retorted, "I am sorry, I have to disagree. The evidence was pretty heavy with taped conversations and so on, and I do not think—" It was too much for Bufalino, and his eyes angry, he interrupted, "When you have a deal with an animal like that, Judge, you will have done the same thing." Even the judge had to agree with Bufalino that Napoli was indeed a bum. Napoli and his family have now been given new identities to protect them from Bufalino's wrath. These close-knit men of Montedoro, as they were called, became the earliest Pennsylvania Mafia leaders, whose sons today continue to fill leadership positions, according to an organized crime report issued in 1970 by the Pennsylvania Crime Commission. Bufalino, for his part, once admitted, "I never knew when I was born." But even in the face of evidence put together by the Immigration and Naturalization Service, he has, over the years, stoutly maintained that he knew where in Pittston, Pennsylvania, not Italy. An examination by immigration officials of Luzerne County birth records in the late 1950s found an entry that seemed to support his claim. But it was then discovered that a court clerk, whose name also happened to be Bufalino, had tampered with the records for 1903. A common pleas court judge then ordered the entry stricken. Bufalino's parents died when he was young, and he was raised by relatives in Italy between 1910 and 1914, and then by relatives in Pittston and later in Buffalo, New York. His teachers considered him a bright, well-behaved youngster. Good grades. His Pittston grade school report cards for 1915 and 1916 show that he received all A's and B's, despite some difficulty with English. His grade for deportment was a steady A. He was, however, a good deal older than his classmates. In 1916, at age 13, he was only in the 5th grade. It was in Buffalo, where he enrolled in the Elm Vocational School in 1917, that he decided on a career as an auto mechanic. His best grades, 94s, were in auto science and garage practice. That was the end of his formal education. In 1952, he jokingly told an inquisitive employee of Dun & Bradstreet, the credit reporting firm, that he had earned an electrical engineering degree from Harvard. The naive employee put the information in his report. The spurious biography is now part of his immigration file. In 1918, at the age of 15, Bufalino went to work as a mechanic in a Buffalo garage. He became, he proudly said, a specialist in internal combustion engines. He was arrested 8 times in the 1920s, mainly for crimes involving stolen autos, such things as altering serial numbers and receiving stolen property. Each time he was acquitted. Between 1931 and 1937, his only legal troubles arose from a penchant for running stop signs. He had 7 moving violations. It was in Buffalo that Bufalino met his wife, Caroline Sciandra, whom he married in 1928. The coal mines. It was also in Buffalo that he first came into contact with Santo Volpe, who had acquired an interest in a Buffalo brewing company and was rapidly consolidating his position as the boss of organized crime in the northeast Pennsylvania coal country. Volpe was particularly close to the Medico family and was the godfather of Philip T. Medico, who runs the company today. Volpe, said the Pennsylvania Crime Commission in its 1970 report, had begun as an impoverished coal miner, but through skillful manipulation was able to obtain an interest in a number of coal mines. During the 1930s, he was a member of the State Coal Commission, which controlled the tonnage that each company was permitted to mine. These coal interests served as a strong economic base from which the Volpe Cosa Nostra family enriched itself, the Crime Commission report said. The family gradually took over both coal companies and locals of the United Mine Workers Union and benefited from the sweetheart contracts that could thus be obtained. In 1939, Bufalino moved back to Pittston and went to work for the Volpe Coal Company. His rise in the ranks of organized crime had begun. Promotions. Within the year, Volpe died and was succeeded as boss by John Sciandra, a partner in Knox Coal, who also reputedly controlled locals of the United Mine Workers Union. Sciandra's son, Angelo Joseph, would become a close friend of Bufalino, a reputed business associate in the ABS Construction Company, B for Bufalino, S for Sciandra, and a fellow participant in the Appalachian mob meeting. But by the end of World War II, the undisputed boss of the crime family was Joseph Barbara, known as Joe Barber, a man with a grim reputation for violence and ruthlessness. He had begun as a bootlegger and was often a suspect in murder cases. By the time he became boss, Barbara had given up bootlegging and had been running an outwardly legitimate business, the Mission Beverage Company, a beer and soft drink distributorship in Endicott, New York, near Appalachian. The New York State Liquor Authority later said that Barbara originally had been financed with a $65,000 loan from fellow bootleggers Angelo Polizzi and Santo Volpe and coal barons Louis Pagnotti and Charles Bufalino Russell's uncle. Uncle Charlie, Russell Bufalino once said, was a very, very, very good uncle to me. If I ever needed any money, I could depend on him. Anytime I needed anything, I could get it. Efficiency expert. While working for Volpe Coal, and then with Knox at Pittston Colliery No. 6, Bufalino gained a reputation as a rugged enforcer. He liked to say that he was an efficiency expert. In 1944, Barbara brought Bufalino to Endicott as his sotto capo and nominal chief of maintenance at Mission Beverage, although his real job, apparently, was to bring in new business, by whatever means necessary. The post-war period was one of great turmoil and sudden change in the coal country. Cheap oil, flowing in from the Middle East, depressed the coal business, putting thousands of miners out of work. At the same time, New York City garment manufacturers, beset by high union wages, began moving their operations into northeastern Pennsylvania, hiring the wives of unemployed coal miners at low, non-union wages. The mob, like any other business interested in profits, adjusted. For one thing, it further consolidated its interests in the anthracite coal business, taking over failing properties. Bufalino himself set up a company to ship and sell anthracite. He named it the Famous Coal Co. and made himself president. Famous was bankrolled by coal baron and banker Louis Panotti Sr., a friend of Barbara. The coal came from Panotti's mines. He loaned me the coal, and then I had to lend him the money back, Bufalino once said. Asked if he had to invest any of his own capital, he replied, "My credit with Pagnotti Coal. I didn't have any capital to advance." Famous, which was liquidated in 1955, shipped its coal to a terminal it owned in New York City, using trucks owned by the Pagnotti Company, according to Bufalino. The coal was sold to New York City businesses for heating. Louis Pagnotti Sr. is dead now, and today his children run Pagnotti Enterprises, which is still one of the biggest miners of anthracite in the Northeast. Its main subsidiary, the Jeddo Highland Coal Company, has been the major coal supplier to the Pentagon for the past decade, under contracts arranged by United States Representative Daniel J. Flood. Bufalino began to travel to New York frequently to watch over his coal business, and it was there that he met Max Stein, the owner of several dress companies that were in the process of moving their manufacturing mills to the coal country of northeast Pennsylvania. The major company was called Fairfrocks. Stein officially hired Bufalino as an expediter. An overseer, Stein said, that meant that Bufalino was a mechanic, an overseer, obtains work for us, additional work for us when we need it, and takes care of the plant in Pennsylvania when it requires his services. And Bufalino did not employ his talents on behalf of Fairfrocks alone. He was also an efficiency man for a number of other textile companies, including some owned by Binghamton mobster Anthony Gov Fiumanieri. Bufalino finally went into the garment business for himself. According to the Pennsylvania Crime Commission, he has owned such companies as Penn Drape and Curtain, Bonnie Stewart Dress Company, and Claudia Frocks. Besides his efficiency work for garment companies in the 1950s, Bufalino was also employed by his friends, the Medicos. Philip Medico, who still runs the company, once described the relationship this way. "He used to repair our equipment. I used to work with him, and in our plant, he has helped me considerably, engineering-wise, engineering problems." Bufalino, Medico said, was a man of high caliber, high morals, and just being kind, considerate to people that I have known through all my life. All this, and he still worked for Barbara too. Puzzled pariahs. Russell Bufalino, a man who rose up from poverty, has always considered himself hard-working and industrious, even religious. In Kingston, he was a member of the Holy Name Society and also a member of a religious group called the Holy Medal, the Immigration and Naturalization Service, which began examining Bufalino's background after receiving a letter from FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover suggesting an inquiry following the Appalachian meeting, unearthed a stack of documents establishing that he was born Rosario Alfredo Bufalino on September 21, 1903, in Montedoro, Sicily. The documents, used in his deportation hearings, show that at the age of 2 months, he arrived in the United States from Naples aboard the SS Città di Milano. With him were his mother, Maria Cristina Buccoleri, his 2 sisters, Giuseppa, 6, and Cristina, 2, and his brother, Calogero, 5, who later changed his name to Charles and became an official of a musicians' union in New York City. Bufalino's father, Angelo, was already in America, working as an anthracite coal miner in Pittston, in northeast Pennsylvania, with other immigrants from his home village of Montedoro, the Latores, the Volpes, and the Sciandras. His position. An incredulous immigration hearing officer sarcastically wrote years later, "From Bufalino's testimony, it would appear that the entire Barbara Enterprises, the entire Medico-Electric Company, and the numerous garment enterprises would cease to function unless he went over with his stethoscope and sensitively determined whether the machines were operating efficiently." By this time, Bufalino was far more than a lowly mechanic. As Barbara's sottocapo, he dressed expensively in conservative pin-striped suits, drove big black Chryslers, one was nominally owned by the medicos for insurance purposes, traveled to places like Bimini and Cuba, and frequented nightclubs in New York, where he stayed in a suite at the Hotel Forest. He was a heavy drinker and sometimes got into brawls. One time, a man, angered when Bufalino told some vulgar jokes in the presence of women, flattened the tipsy mobster with a single punch and sat on his chest. Bufalino was apparently so surprised by the incident that he took no retaliatory action. One of his friends was Frankie Carbo, the boxing promoter who was later convicted of trying to muscle in on the earnings of welterweight champion Don Jordan in 1958. He boasted that he knew Sidney Poitier. I exchanged conversations with him at the Del Somma restaurant in New York. Very nice boy. Trips to Cuba. Between 1951 and 1957, he took at least 3 trips to Cuba, staying either at the Hotel Nacional, owned by mobster Meyer Lansky, or at the Sun's Sushi, which was owned at various times by the Pittsburgh-based Manorino mob family and the Trafficante family, now based in Tampa. Federal agents, watching his movements, suspected that he was heavily involved in diamond smuggling and probably drug trafficking. Even then, the Federal Bureau of Narcotics termed him one of the most ruthless and powerful leaders of the mafia in the United States. When Albert Anastasia, the capo di tutti capi, or boss of bosses of organized crime, was murdered gangland style in 1957, Bufalino, coincidentally in New York, was extensively questioned by New York police. He later appeared before a grand jury investigating the murder and reportedly invoked the Fifth Amendment. So it was no surprise to law enforcement agencies that Bufalino emerged as the chief arranger of the Appalachian meeting in November of that year. It was almost a family get-together. Bufalino's New York City mob friends were there, among them John Ormento, a big-time drug dealer, as was Gabriel Kelly Manorino of the Pittsburgh Manorino family. From Pittston came Bufalino business associate Angelo Joseph Sciandra. Medico Industries Inc. sent their transportation manager, James Ostico. Philip Medico later said he thought Ostico had been sent up there to repair a pump. The Appalachian meeting and the accompanying glare of publicity made Bufalino a nationally known figure. He repeatedly invoked his Fifth Amendment privilege against self-incrimination when called to testify before the New York State Reuter Commission, and, as a result, was convicted in state court of conspiracy to obstruct justice, a conviction that was subsequently overturned on appeal. He again took the Fifth repeatedly before a series of New York state and federal congressional committees investigating organized crime, starting in the late 1950s. In Control Outwardly, he acted as if nothing had changed. When Barbara died in 1959, he assumed full control of the crime family businesses. He rode about in a limousine driven by a liveried chauffeur and became extremely friendly with a pretty blonde, Jane Collins, a Lake Ariel, Pennsylvania, coal heiress who traveled with him, invested in his businesses, and gave him the key to her rambling country house, where he sometimes spent the night. Bufalino, ever playing the role of the humble handyman, said he only visited her estate to do plumbing work. But in fact, things had changed. The Immigration and Naturalization Service had cranked up a full-scale investigation. The FBI was watching him. "I am being prosecuted and persecuted," he said once in exasperation. "I am living in a showcase. Every one of my movements has been tailed. I am asked about my private life, which the rights of an individual are being encroached on." He was ordered deported for the first time in 1958, and the Immigration and Naturalization Service actually booked him passage from New York to Italy on the Queen Frederica, sailing on September 12th. No credence. But his lawyers snarled up the order in appeals, and, in 1964, a hearing on his status was held. The hearing officer found Bufalino's testimony so replete with distortion, half-truths, incomplete answers, misleading responses, evasion, concealment, hedging, suppression, equivocation, and endless quibbling that I can give it no credence whatsoever. As an example, the hearing officer cited Bufalino's responses to questions about his work for a garment company called Annalee Frocks. He didn't know whether he worked on machines. He didn't know the extent of what plans he may have laid out. He didn't know if he performed manual labor, or he doesn't remember. And again, we see that whenever he's boxed in for specifics, he suffers forensic amnesia, or what may otherwise be dubbed the Freudian fifth. A few months later, Bufalino was once again ordered deported as an undocumented immigrant. This time, the Immigration and Naturalization Service bought him a plane ticket. His lawyers appealed. The Elks revoked his membership because he was not a true American. The FBI also was focusing on his activities. In 1969, he became a major target of the first Justice Department strike force created to attack organized crime. A grand jury in Buffalo indicted him a year later on charges of trafficking in 60 stolen color television sets. The key witness claimed to have heard snatches of a conversation in which Bufalino and a co-defendant discussed arranging to fence the sets. He was acquitted a year later. In 1971, the Internal Revenue Service put a $21,000 line on Bufalino's Kingston house for non-payment of back taxes. And in April 1973, he was once more indicted by a federal grand jury, charged with ordering the beating of rival vending machine operators in Binghamton and Syracuse and the destruction of their equipment. Again, he was acquitted. It was that year, too, that he lost his immigration case after an almost 10-year battle that ultimately went to the U.S. Supreme Court. He was finally, officially, an undocumented immigrant. The Immigration Department booked him on a Pan-American flight to Rome. Protests from friends, relatives, and friends bombarded the White House, the Immigration and Naturalization Service, and the office of Senate Minority Leader Hugh Scott, Republican Pennsylvania, with letters and telegrams, most of them bearing identical messages. A Pittston woman, Donna Ostico, wrote Scott that Bufalino's forced deportation was unjustified and cruel. Russell Bufalino, her letter continued, did not burn draft headquarters or go around as an anti-war pacifist. He did not cause violent damage to this country, as was done by many. He has helped many charitable organizations and many people get into business. He is one of the greatest men we could have in our country. The letters changed nothing. On the appointed day, Bufalino, wearing a conservative pinstriped suit, a silk shirt and a tie, rolled into Philadelphia in a big, wine-colored Lincoln Continental to surrender to immigration officials. With him were angry, weeping relatives there to say a last goodbye. His wife had been too ill to make the trip. But at the last minute, the Italian government refused to issue Bufalino a travel document. "I suppose the Italian government does not feel like welcoming other countries' criminals," said the Italian consul, Dr. Filippo Anfuso. Bufalino's family was ecstatic, and the most joyful of all of them was Larry Bufalino, a nephew. Upon hearing the news, he leaped in the air, yelping, and hugged his uncle, shouting, "Thank God, thank God." 3 years later, it was the same Larry Bufalino who told his friend Giacomo, Jack, Napoli, that if he wanted diamonds in Manhattan, the man to see was Herbie Jacobs. And so, after 50 years in crime, Russell Bufalino went to jail. At his sentencing, Barbara S. Jones, the assistant U.S. attorney who prosecuted him, told the judge that Bufalino had engaged in criminal activities throughout his life. Those activities have included loan sharking, illegal gambling, transportation of stolen property, and labor racketeering. "The people of the United States," she said, "have a right to protection from Russell Bufalino." The judge agreed. This meticulously crafted report from the Crime Commission delves into the labyrinthine history of these families and offers insights into the initial thoughts of the FBI concerning Hoffa's enigmatic vanishing act. What makes this narrative more compelling is the shadowy figure of Frank the Irishman Sheeran, whose confession to author Charles Brandt shed new light on these interconnected criminal tales. Throughout the report, the omnipresent linkage between Sheeran, Bufalino, and the Hoffa case becomes strikingly apparent, painting a vivid portrait of intrigue and treachery in the world of organized crime. At this writing, it appears that the Russell Bufalino family, which operates in northeastern Pennsylvania, New York State, and New York City, may be the most powerful Cosa Nostra family in the Commonwealth. The power which is held by Bufalino and his family should not be underestimated. A decade of organized crime. 1980, report the Pennsylvania Crime Commission. A dramatic change has occurred since these words appeared in the Crime Commission's annual report of 1980. As the decade ends, the family is weakened and its future problematic. This once formidable La Cosa Nostra family, headed by boss Russell Bufalino, traces its origins to the late 1800s in the Pittston area of Luzerne County. Rosario Albert Bufalino was born on October 29, 1903, in Sicily. He became boss of the northeastern Pennsylvania Cosa Nostra family in 1959, establishing himself as one of the nation's most ruthless and powerful organized crime figures. In fact, Bufalino, who is 85 and resides at 304 East Dorrance Avenue, Kingston, Pennsylvania, has been credited with arranging the infamous Appalachian Convention of leading organized crime figures in 1957 at the Appalachian, New York, home of his predecessor, the late Joseph Barbara, Sr. Though involved in diverse activities, the family's power was established in labor racketeering in the region's garment and coal industries. To this end, Bufalino traveled weekly from his Kingston home to New York City for many years. Though the family consisted of 35 active members in 1980, today it comprises less than half that number. The family's decline can be traced back to the late 70s, when Bufalino was found guilty of extortion and sentenced to 4 years in prison. Bufalino began his first prison term in August 1978, despite a lengthy career in crime. Among the reasons for the declining power of the family are Bufalino's apparent reluctance to recruit new members and the aging, ill health, and incarceration of principal leaders. Bufalino is in ill health and remains incarcerated at the Medical Center for Federal Prisoners in Springfield, Montana. He is scheduled for release in May 1989, having served a term for violating the civil rights of Jack Napoli, a man he was convicted of extorting in 1977. James Dave Ostico, aged 76, of 112 Elizabeth Street, Pittston, is Bufalino's underboss. He was released from federal prison in August 1988, but remains under federal supervision. Ostico was convicted of jury tampering. During the spring of 1988, Anthony Frank Guarnieri, aged 78, 6531 Southeast Federal Highway, Stuart, Florida, who oversees the family's business there, entered guilty pleas in district courts in New York, Nevada, and Florida for his role in trafficking in marijuana and counterfeit goods, and for conspiracy to manufacture a silencer. He received a 2-year prison term and a $50,000 fine in July 1988 and is incarcerated at the Medical Center for Federal Prisoners in Springfield, Montana, with his boss, Bufalino. Testimony at Guarnieri's sentencing hearing revealed that the Bufalino Mafia family participates in illegal gambling, loan sharking, narcotics trafficking, and labor racketeering. Guarnieri was directly involved in payoffs and sweetheart contracts that would facilitate management. FBI agents testified that the Bufalino family participates in labor racketeering with members of the Teamsters Union. Consigliere Edward Sciandra, age 76, 2340 Center Avenue, Belmore, Long Island, New York, has been managing the family's business in New York and participates in counterfeit goods, bookmaking, and loan sharking. Sciandra also has been involved with the California entertainment industry. A top executive of MCA, Movie Corporation of America, a giant entertainment conglomerate with over $2 billion in revenue per year, is under investigation for his involvement with a New Jersey company tied to Sciandra, North Star Graphics. A federal affidavit alleges that Eugene Giacinto, aged 48, who heads MCA's $100 million a year home video division, funneled money to Sciandra through contracts MCA held with North Star Graphics. FBI records indicate that North Star, which provides MCA with containers for video cassette movies, is owned by Michael Delgazio, a close associate of Sciandra. The Bufalino family, through Sciandra, has maintained a long and veiled relationship with MCA and its subsidiary Universal Pictures. In 1982, Sciandra was convicted on income tax charges resulting from his receipt of kickbacks for referring MCA Universal business to a New York company, though he was neither an employee nor authorized agent of Universal. A sentencing memorandum in district court in New York stated that, because of his organized crime connections, Sciandra was able to direct hundreds of thousands of dollars of MCA's Universal Division film editing and film processing work to one company in return for 10% in cash under the table. The federal affidavit alleges that Sciandra also tried to extort money from Giacinto concerning the sale of movie rights to Universal, including one film portraying the life of the late Meyer Lansky, an underworld financial advisor, purchased by the studio in 1987. At the heart of the current case is MCA's relationship with North Star Graphics. The FBI is attempting to determine why MCA's home video division, of which Giacinto was president until December 1965, contracted with North Star for its printing and packaging business. MCA's contract with North Star is estimated at several $1 million per year. According to a former MCA executive, an internal audit conducted a few years back turned up some irregularities, somewhere between $400,000 and $500,000 that had been paid out for work that wasn't actually done by North Star. The audit was critical of Giacinto for awarding a multi-million-dollar contract to North Star at higher than normal prices, the former official said. In the summer of 1957, Giacinto informed Sciandra that, because of the audit, something might occur to end North Star's relationship with MCA. The affidavit, relying on FBI-intercepted conversations, states, Sciandra's reaction to this news was irrational and of concern to various mafia members. The mafia may be concerned that Sciandra may attract attention and should be retired. Afraid he was being eliminated from his lucrative relationship with MCA, Sciandra began pressuring Giacinto. To protect himself, the FBI claims, Giacinto sought the help of John Gotti, boss of the Gambino Mafia family in New York City. During a sit-down with Sciandra, Gotti ordered him to stay away from Giacinto. The investigation is being continued by the United States Department of Justice. A family member who has remained in close contact with Bufalino during his incarceration is William D'Elia, 42, Northview Drive, Hughestown, Pennsylvania. D'Elia has been a surrogate for Bufalino during the latter's incarceration. The table below reveals an average age of 65 years for all Bufalino Mafia family members and a median age of 67 years. In addition, all currently identified members were members at the beginning of the decade. Some of the members in the Bufalino family are listed below: Salvatore Alecchia, aged 74, Angelo Bufalino, aged 59, Russell Bufalino, aged 85, Frank Cannone, aged 67, one of the youngest, William D'Elia, aged 42, Anthony De Stefano, aged 78, Charles Fratello, aged 48, Anthony Guarnieri, aged 78, Michael Insalacco, aged 52, William Meringola, aged 63, Anthony Mosco, aged 46, James Ostico, aged 76, Augustine Riolo, aged 71, Samuel Rotella, aged 66, Anthony Santa Cruz Jr., aged 57, Albert Scalliot, aged 69, and Edward Sciandra, aged 76. Despite the evidence of ongoing activity, the leadership of the Bufalino Mafia family is aging and in poor health. Its membership is in decline. Bufalino has been reluctant to admit new members. If the Bufalino Mafia family is not soon revitalized, there is a probability that the interests of this family will be assumed by another mafia family or criminal organization. LaRocca and the Genovese family, Western Pennsylvania, La Cosa Nostra. When Joseph Rosa, 29, proclaimed himself a made member of the LaRocca and Genovese Mafia family, it signaled the beginning of still another examination into this Mafia family. Rosa testified that he became a Mafia member as a matter of birthright and had cemented his place among family members by engaging in various criminal activities for their benefit. Coupled with testimony from Mafia enforcer Marvin Babe Droznek, 41, their allegations assumed a level of credibility and were instrumental in sending 27 individuals to prison. The Rosa Droznek narcotics case was the largest in Western Pennsylvania history. Some of the defendants are associates of the LaRocca and Genovese Mafia family. Others include an assistant district attorney and a veteran police officer. According to the 113 counts federal grand jury indictment, the defendants distributed more than 200 kilograms of cocaine in the eastern suburbs of Pittsburgh during the last 4 years. The federal grand jury indictment charged that Mafia associate Rosa and William Kostrick, 42, 507 Chestnut Street, McKeesport, were the ringleaders of this cocaine operation. Rosa is the son of the late Frank J. Rosa, a member of the LaRocca Genovese Mafia family, and the grandson of Joseph Seeker, aged 80, also a Mafia family member. Rosa pleaded guilty to charges that he operated a continuing criminal enterprise and of tax evasion, and was sentenced in February 1989 to 10 years in prison with no possible parole. Kostrick, who formerly operated a business firm in McKeesport called Zip Vending, was a major cocaine supplier to Droznek, a bookmaker and drug dealer. Droznek pleaded guilty to operating a continuing criminal enterprise and is serving a 15-year prison term with no possible parole. Droznek, formerly of Monroeville, was the first to turn state's evidence in the case and agree to cooperate with federal authorities. Droznek wore an FBI body wire and purchased a half kilo of cocaine from Rosa, with FBI agents videotaping the transaction. Because of his cooperation, his undercover role, and his testimony before a federal grand jury and his later trial testimony, 25 of the 27 defendants pleaded guilty, leaving only Kostrick and Dino, Doughboy. Romano, 32, 175 Mackenzie Drive, Penn Hills, to face trial. During the trial, Rosa, a government witness, was asked by a defense attorney if he was a member of organized crime. He answered, "Yes." "What is it called?" He answered, "The Mafia." Later in his testimony, Rosa told the court, "In my case, I was born into the family, Kostrick and Romano were convicted of conducting a continuing criminal enterprise by a jury trial in U.S. District Court. During the sentencing hearing, the judge told Kostrick that he was a danger to society and needed to be isolated. The judge sentenced Kostrick to 30 years in prison with no possible parole and 5 years of supervised release. Romano received a 15-year prison term plus 5 years of supervised release. Among the remaining 25 defendants were former Allegheny County District Attorney Perry Perino, 32, 227 West 8th Avenue, Homestead, and Mark D. Nicklow, aged 37, 2034. Lewem Avenue, North Versailles, a veteran member of the police department in that municipality. Perino admitted that he assisted members of the drug conspiracy by providing them with information entrusted to him in his capacity as a public official. During the sentencing hearing, the judge told Perino that he was despicable and violated the public trust. Instead of prosecuting criminals, the judge continued, "You assisted them by providing them with information." Perino and Nicklow each were sentenced to 10 years in prison plus 5 years of supervised release. Another defendant was Ronald Fat Sam Plisco, a.k.a. Sam Catalano, age 37, 161 Regal Court, Monroeville, a longtime bookmaker and mafia associate with ties to Charles J., Chucky Porter, 55, and Frank D. Sue. Sonny Amato, aged 61, both of whom are members of the LaRocca and Genovese Mafia family. Victor Marchitello, aged 39, 541 Bessemer Avenue, East Pittsburgh, who operated a tavern known as Maestro's Cafe in Wilmerding, from which Droznek and others had been operating for years, also pleaded guilty and received 5 years in prison without possible parole and 5 years of supervised release. Another significant individual in the case was William A. Machine Gun Tony D'Adamo, aged 59, 104 Garden Street, Monongahela. D'Adamo pleaded guilty to providing members of the drug cartel with machine guns and silencers. D'Adamo, a mafia family associate with a history of firearms violations, received a 10-year sentence. Despite Rosa's public declaration of being a mafia member by birth, law enforcement authorities view this with skepticism. Rosa's and Droznek's testimony have again focused public attention on the LaRocca and Genovese Mafia family. Furthermore, it has generated residual investigations that threaten to further undermine this mafia family. A new hierarchy begins to emerge. During the past few years, there has been a noticeable shift in the power structure of the LaRocca and Genovese family. Rosa's and Droznek's testimonies confirmed that Porter and his closest associates, Louis Raucci, 58, and Henry Zebo Zotola, 53, are major income producers, and that Porter has the ear of the family boss, Michael Genovese, 69. According to Robert Bobby Wine Iannelli, 58, 315 Thompson Run Road, August Augie Ferroni, 62, 1079, North Avenue, Adolph Jr. Williams, 55, 274, Foxcroft Drive, all of Pittsburgh, and Paul No Legs Hankish, 57, 92. Brentwood Avenue, Wheeling, WV, turn-in betting action to Porter. Rosa and Droznek claimed that Raucci and Zotola are both active in narcotics trafficking and loan sharking. On the surface, Porter's involvement with narcotics appears inconsistent with Genovese's philosophical opposition to drugs, but Porter is credited with saying that he views narcotics to quick capital and not a major source of revenue. He prefers to let associates rather than members absorb the risk, as can be seen by the Rosa trial. Although 27 individuals were eventually convicted of narcotics, trafficking, or associated offences, none were considered mafia members. The following are members of the LaRocca and Genovese Mafia family: Michael Genovese, 69, 4348, Clendenning Road, Gibsonia, Pennsylvania; Frank Sonny Amato, Jr., 61, 704 Broadway Street, East McKeesport, Pennsylvania; Second, John Bazzano, Jr., 61, 107. Lynbrook Drive, McMurray, Pennsylvania; Anthony Wango Capizzi, 63, 44 Fifth One Middle Road, Allison Park, Pennsylvania; Thomas Sonny Ciancuti, 59, 1906, Kenneth Avenue, New Kensington, Pennsylvania. Pasquale Macri, Pat Ferruccio, 71, owner of Liberty Vending, 401 High Street, Canton, Ohio. Charles J. Chucky, Porter, 55, 3999, Old William Penn Highway, Penn Hills, Pennsylvania. Louis Raucci, 58, 133, Hulton Road, Verona, Pennsylvania. Antonio Anthony Ripepi, 86, 4720, Brownsville Road, Pittsburgh. Joseph Seeker, Sr., 80, 1148, Jefferson Heights, Penn Hills. Henry Zotola, 53, 9242, Wedgwood Drive, Pittsburgh. The control exercised by this mafia family can be seen in the Erie, Pennsylvania gambling market. Iannelli, a close associate of mafia family member Anthony Wango Capizzi, 63, collected Erie layoff gambling money from Alfred Del Sandro until Del Sandro's death in July 1988. At Del Sandro's funeral, however, Iannelli purposely avoided contact with Del Sandro's successor, John Jack Miller, 59, 5449 Pepperwood Circle, Erie. Miller had more than 35 numbers of writers grossing $125,000 weekly in sports and numbers action at that time, and, until late 1988, was considered the largest bookmaker in Erie. Since then, Miller's organization has declined and is now ranked third. In March 1989, Miller was indicted by the IRS on charges stemming from gambling-related activities. During the past 3 months, a new hierarchy has emerged within the Erie gambling community led by William J. Anderson, 60, 1809 Treetop Drive, and his partner, Leonard Alecki, 55, 9 West 4th Street, apartment 1. The second largest operation is the province of Philip S. Torelli, 56, 2908 Broadlawn Drive, and Raymond Ferrito, 59, 724 Brown Avenue, both of Erie. Torelli and Ferrito inherited Frank Bolo Dovershaw's sports and numbers action in 1983 after Dovershaw's was murdered. Anderson and Alexi lay off their betting action to LaRocca Genovese Mafia Family Associates, while Torelli and Ferrito lay off to another Mafia associate, Manuel Mike the Greek Xenakis, 41, 100 Hayswold Drive, Coraopolis, Pennsylvania. Xenakis and Ferrito were arrested together in June 1987 on gambling charges. That case is still pending. Xenakis, in turn, lays off Ciancuti associate John Sabatini, 48, 1693 Seaton Avenue, Coraopolis. The LaRocca Genovese Mafia family has invested in video poker vending, while remaining firmly entrenched in traditional criminal activities, including gambling, loan sharking, extortion, and narcotics. On January 19, 1989, Mafia family member Pasquale Ferruccio, 71, owner of the Liberty Vending Company in Canton, Ohio, was indicted by the Cleveland Federal Organized Crime Strike Force on racketeering charges resulting from the illegal use of video poker machines as a gambling device in Ohio and Pennsylvania. Over the past few years, law enforcement agencies have reported that the LaRocca Genovese family is experiencing a decline in influence. These observations are based upon an apparent lack of new blood, coupled with an aging leadership. Seeker and Ripepi are both in their 80s, and Ferruccio is 71. Only Ripepi remains an active member, and Ferruccio's future is clouded by his recent indictment. Still, the average age of the LaRocca Genovese Mafia family members, currently figured at 65 years, drops to only 60 years when those 3 individuals are excluded from the equation. Age alone will not precipitate the decline of the LaRocca Genovese Mafia family. Rather, the limited membership will be hard-pressed to withstand a series of prosecutorial efforts aimed at the family's hierarchy. Several convictions would have enormous impact, perhaps comparable to that encountered by Cleveland's Licavoli Mafia family, which was devastated by prosecutions brought by an FBI organized crime task force. Notwithstanding similar circumstances, the LaRocca Genovese family appears capable of enduring. Status of the Scarfo La Cosa Nostra family. The Philadelphia Mafia, headed by Nicodemo Little Nicky Scarfo, 60, 26. North Georgia Avenue, Apartment LC, Atlantic City, New Jersey, is in further disarray because of Scarfo's convictions for murder and for racketeering. 19 other family members have also been convicted on various charges within the past year. Scarfo's primitive gangster mentality and vicious street thug characteristics are considered crucial factors leading to the current disintegration of his criminal enterprise. Besides these characteristics, Scarfo lacked the organizational and managerial skills necessary to run the business ventures of an organized crime family. Indiscriminate violence was used as Scarfo's primary means of control within the family and on the street. Family members and associates were aware that being suspected of wrongdoing against the family or failure to conduct orders was sufficient cause for Scarfo to order their murder. Instead of instilling loyalty, this type of control did the opposite. Several family members sought the protection of law enforcement because they feared Scarfo's wrath. Nicholas "Nicky" Crow Caramandi, 53, a soldier in the family, and Thomas Del Giorno, 48, a former capo in the family, have testified against Scarfo and other family members and are now in the Federal Witness Protection Program. An example of this unrestrained use of violence, the Scarfo Mafia family, was demonstrated in the federal racketeering trial of Scarfo and 16 other family members. In this trial, 9 murders and 4 attempted murders were among the acts for which the defendants were convicted. Additionally, Scarfo and 7 other Mafia family members were convicted on April 5, 1989, of first-degree murder for the July 1985 slaying of Frank D. Alfonso. The 8 defendants were sentenced to life in prison. De Alfonso, a family associate, was killed because of his disrespect toward Scarfo. One of the original defendants in the trial was Eugene Milano, 29, 3000 South 15th Street, Philadelphia, who became a government witness and testified against Mafia family members and his brother, Nicholas Milano, 28, same address, rather than face first-degree murder charges. The use or threat of violence was also displayed in the collection of street tax or elbow from drug dealers and bookmakers in Philadelphia. In a June 1988 indictment, based on evidence presented by the Philadelphia office of the Federal Organized Crime Strike Force, Stanley E. Branch, 55, 2201 Pennsylvania Avenue, Apartment 208, Philadelphia, and John Johnny Chang Ciancaglini, 33, 2040, South 13th Street, Philadelphia, the son of convicted Mafia capo Joseph A. Ciancaglini, were accused of conspiring to extort and attempting to extort a monetary street tax from area drug dealers through the use of actual and threatened force, violence, and fear. The indictment also named the following individuals as unindicted co-conspirators: Kevin Hartzell, 29, 1527 Grant Street; Norman Litt, 48, 2401 Pennsylvania Avenue, Apartment 5A12; Salvatore Merlino, 49, 927 Jackson Street, all of Philadelphia; Del Giorno, and Scarfo. The indictment charged that from approximately July 1985 through about February 1986, Branch and Ciancaglini, with Hartzell and Litt, working under the auspices of the Philadelphia Mafia family, participated in a scheme to extort money from at least 3 drug dealers. Branch and Ciancaglini had obtained permission from Mafia boss Scarfo and his then underboss Merlino to act on their behalf in collecting as much as $1,000 per week from the targeted drug dealers. The collected money was to be divided among the 4 partners, Branch, Ciancaglini, Hartzell, and Litt, with a percentage turned over to the high-ranking members of the Philadelphia Mafia family. Litt, a former bookmaker and a self-described Mafia associate, who is now in the Federal Witness Protection Program, is awaiting sentencing after pleading guilty to illegal gambling and conspiracy in another case. According to Litt's testimony, in the January 1989 trial of Branch and Ciancaglini, he was approached by Branch and invited to join the operation after being told that Scarfo had sanctioned the scheme. He further testified that the 4 partners worked together, collecting at least $8,000 before making their first division of profits. It was at that time, Litt testified, that Branch was dropped from the scheme when the partners discovered he had failed to forward the first $4,000 payment due the Scarfo Mafia family. One of the extortion victims, admitted drug dealer Frank Trachtenberg, 47, 1833 Sinclair Circle, Southampton, Pennsylvania, who is in prison on a federal drug conviction, also testified during the trial. He testified that he met with Litt and Branch in August 1985, at which time they demanded $1,000 a week as respect for the downtown mob. Trachtenberg told the jury, "I agreed to pay. I was in fear for my life," after learning from his own sources that they did indeed have permission from the Scarfo organization to shake down drug dealers. Trachtenberg stated that he met shortly thereafter with Litt and Hartzell to make his first payment. It was at that meeting, according to Trachtenberg, that Hartzell demanded the name of his cocaine source. When he refused to supply the name, he testified that Hartzell slashed his forehead with a knife. In June 1988, Hartzell, who has an arrest record for assault dating back to 1978, admitted to his role in the operation, and in October 1988 began serving a 3-year sentence in federal prison. On January 13, 1989, the jury found Branch and Ciancaglini guilty of participating in the extortion operation. Branch was convicted on 1 count each of conspiracy and extortion. On March 20, 1989, he was sentenced to 5 years in prison and fined $5,000. Immediately after the sentence was imposed, his attorney said an appeal would be filed. The judge agreed to stay the sentence pending the outcome of the appeal, and Branch remains free on bail. Ciancaglini was convicted of 1 count each of conspiracy and extortion, and 2 counts of attempted extortion. On March 13, 1989, he was sentenced to 9 years in prison and fined $5,000 and ordered to report to prison on March 30th. A prosecutor for the organized crime strike force said, "A substantial prison term was merited because Ciancaglini was the leader and directed the conspiracy. He also actively participated in the extortion and personally contacted each of the extortion victims." Narcotics. The prohibited vice. The involvement of the Philadelphia Mafia in the distribution of drugs was further evident during the past year. One of the charges in the federal racketeering conviction involved the illegal distribution of methamphetamine, or speed, and demonstrated the involvement of several Mafia family members in the trafficking of narcotics. In another case, Albert Reds Pontani, 62, of Trenton, New Jersey, identified as the hand-picked caretaker boss of the Scarfo Mafia family and the recognized leader of the organization's Mercer County, New Jersey territory, was named with 4 associates in a New Jersey federal RICO indictment in February 1988. On November 9, 1988, a federal jury in Newark, New Jersey, convicted Pontani of running a continuing criminal enterprise involved in the distribution and sale of cocaine, loan sharking, and extortion. He also was found guilty of possession of and conspiracy to smuggle phenyl-2-propanone, P2P, a chemical component of methamphetamine, into the United States from Mexico, the Dominican Republic, and Belize, Central America. Co-defendants in the case were Daniel Marino, 57, of Cherry Hill, New Jersey, convicted on charges of helping to run the criminal enterprise, extortion, cocaine distribution, and involvement in the P2P conspiracy, and Angelo Capi Bellardo, 60, and Daniel Mucci, 52, both of Trenton, New Jersey, convicted of being part of the P2P conspiracy. Bellardo also was found guilty of loan sharking, while the jury acquitted Mucci on loan sharking charges. The 5th defendant, James Wilson, 46, of Camden, New Jersey, owner of Wilson & Wilson Insurance Company, was convicted of using his status as a former Camden police officer and legitimate businessman to help Pontani and others conceal their distribution of cocaine. According to the testimony of a mid-sized customer and admitted cocaine distributor for Pontani. The group sought to organize all the cocaine dealers in Camden's African American and Hispanic neighborhoods to gain control of their numbers business. One government witness who testified about the P2P smuggling scheme was Ronald P. Jack Diamond Bramer, a New Orleans, Louisiana restaurant owner and admitted drug dealer. According to Bramer's testimony, he helped establish the smuggling operation to pay off a loan sharking debt he owed Pontani. Bramer, who was in Louisiana to avoid extradition to New York, had borrowed $20,000 from Pontani to keep his restaurant business solvent. Bramer agreed to introduce Pontani and his associates to an acquaintance who operated a drug smuggling operation in the United States from Mexico. Bramer further stated that he viewed this as an opportunity to help decrease his debt, which was accruing at an interest rate of 100%. In January 1989, Pontani was sentenced to 30 years in prison. Marino received a 20-year prison sentence, and Bilardo and Mucci were each sentenced to 10 years. After the authorities agreed with his defense attorney that Wilson was not an organized crime figure, he was sentenced to 4 years imprisonment. In addition to the above case, Pontani, Marino, Bramer, and others were also scheduled for trial on similar drug charges relating to the P2P conspiracy in federal court in Louisiana, based on a separate federal RICO indictment announced there in February 1988. On February 14, 1989, Pontani and Marino pleaded guilty in federal court in New Orleans to charges of interstate travel in aid of racketeering. They were each sentenced to 5 years in prison and 5 years probation. The sentences will run concurrent with the ones they are already serving. In the New Orleans case, Bramer pleaded guilty in 1988 to conspiracy and is to be sentenced on April 27, 1989. Other Mafia family members and associates have been convicted of charges relating to the importation of P2P and the distribution of methamphetamine during the past several years. Ralph Steino, Jr., 56, 3127 South 13th Street, Philadelphia, a member of the Philadelphia Mafia, was found guilty July 15, 1988, of charges of participating in a conspiracy to control the importation and sale of P2P. He was indicted in June 1987 with Scarfo and 26 other individuals. However, he was tried separately because he was a fugitive at the time of their trial. 12 other individuals named on the same indictment were convicted March 7, 1988, for trafficking in methamphetamine. Through these convictions, it was clearly shown that, despite claims to the contrary, the Philadelphia Mafia was heavily involved in the distribution of methamphetamine, a controlled, dangerous substance. Gambling, the lifeblood of La Cosa Nostra. The Philadelphia Mafia has remained active in gambling throughout Philadelphia and New Jersey. Thomas Del Giorno, a Philadelphia Mafia capo who became a cooperating witness, stated that the biggest source of illegal income for the Mafia is derived from gambling, followed by loan sharking, extortion, and narcotics. Investigations by law enforcement agencies have uncovered several gambling operations headed by members of the Philadelphia Mafia. A sports betting operation controlled by Salvatore Shotzi Sparacchio, 67, 1613 Lawncrest Lane, Gloucester Township, New Jersey, was disrupted by a joint investigation of the Philadelphia Police Department, the New Jersey State Police, and the Camden County Prosecutor's Office. Sparacchio, who was overseeing Scarfo's southern New Jersey gambling operations, was arrested with 14 other individuals. Search warrants served at several locations in New Jersey and Pennsylvania resulted in the confiscation of over $20,000 in currency and betting slips totaling more than $1.2 million. Typically, according to Del Giorno, when a boss is removed from his position, the capos convene to select nominees and elect the new boss. The new boss must then meet the approval of Mafia Commission in New York. The current chaos in the Philadelphia Mafia, as well as the decimation of the commission, however, makes this improbable. Each of the 4 active capos in the family has either been convicted or indicted by law enforcement agencies. In fact, the entire hierarchy of the family is in disarray. The family's underboss, Philip M. Leonetti, 36, South Adams Avenue, Margate, New Jersey, and capos Joseph A. Ciancaglini, 54, 732 South Hutchinson Street, Philadelphia, and Francis Oyanarella, Jr., 41, 22-28. South 22nd Street, Philadelphia, were convicted in the racketeering trial with Scarfo and 13 other Mafia family members. Capo Santo Idone has been indicted on federal charges. Capo Pasquale Martirano has been indicted on gambling and loan sharking charges. Restructuring of the family from within the soldier ranks could also prove to be difficult. Of the 53 identified soldiers in the family, 18 have been convicted, 3 are currently facing charges, and 1 is on federal probation. Of the remaining soldiers, some are inactive due to their age or health problems. The following chart depicts the names and ages of those soldiers in the Philadelphia Mafia who are not currently under indictment and are not pending sentencing for any crime. Here is a list of active Scarfo family members, released in 1980. Joseph A. Bellina, aged 80, Felix Bocchino, aged 70, Fulvio A. Capotti, aged 53, Anthony Casella, aged 74, Charles Thomas Costello, aged 78, Joseph J. Costello, aged 56, Anthony V. Ferrante, aged 68, Gerardo Fuzel, aged 72, John Grande, aged 55, Alfredo J. Yetzi, aged 77, Joseph Lanciano, aged 83, Joseph M. Licata, aged 47, Peter J. Maggio, aged 68, Alphonse J. Marconi, aged 64, Guerino Marconi, aged 58, Frank Martucci, aged 63, Raffaello Napoli, aged 74, Frank Nicoletti, aged 77, Salvatore Pasalacqua, aged 79, Joseph Piccolo, ages 82, Michael D. Piccolo, aged 77, Antonio Di Polina, aged 96, Anthony J. Pungatore, aged 68, Michael B. Ricciardi, Jr., aged 54, Santo M. Romeo, aged 62, Dominic Rugnetta, aged 65, Samuel A. Scafidi, aged 67, Joseph Scagliat, Sr., aged 77, Antonio Sciglitano, aged 62, Joseph A. Sodano, aged 51, Frank C. Zirpoli, aged 81. The average age of this group is 69 years. The youngest is 47, and the oldest is 96. Several members within the family have been mentioned as candidates for boss. However, most have been discounted due to arrests, convictions, poor health, and old age. The family consigliere, Anthony F. Piccolo, 66, Whitehaven Condominiums, Unit B2, 503, White Horse Pike, Collingswood, New Jersey, has been mentioned as a successor because of his blood relationship to his cousin Nicodemo Scarfo and uncles Joseph and Michael Piccolo. However, Piccolo is unlikely to be able to take control of the family because of his federal probation. Illicit activities such as gambling, loan sharking, and narcotics trafficking, once under the control of Scarfo, are currently operating independently. There are few individuals within the family who have the power to control these illicit enterprises. Another indication of weakness is that Mafia family is not currently collecting a street tax in Philadelphia. The powerful Gambino Mafia family in New York has had a long and close relationship with the Philadelphia family. The Gambino family has traditionally been involved in gambling, loan sharking, and narcotics activities in New Jersey. Because of recent indictments, Scarfo's New Jersey gambling interests are operating without supervision. This leaves that operation ripe for takeover by an aggressive leader such as John Gotti, 47, 160 11 85th Street, Howard Beach, NY, boss of the Gambino Mafia family. Efforts toward a takeover of Scarfo's rackets have already occurred. According to testimony at a federal racketeering trial in Newark, New Jersey, leaders of the Genovese Mafia family plotted the death of John Gotti. This was, in part, the result of a disagreement between the two families over how to divide Scarfo's northern New Jersey interests, formerly controlled by the late Antonio Caponigro, who was murdered by a member of the Genovese Mafia family in April 1980. Meetings between surrogates of Scarfo and members of the Gambino Mafia family are occurring, the intent of which is to resolve the current void in leadership. The disappearance of Hoffa. Hoffa received an executive grant of clemency from President Richard M. Nixon on December 23, 1971, without the customary consultation with the judge who sentenced him. And even though the U.S. Parole Board on 3 occasions in the preceding 2 years had considered and unanimously rejected his requests for release, the Parole Board's decisions had, in part, been based on advice from the Justice Department that Hoffa was tied to organized crime. There were also ugly rumors about the clemency grant. The New York Times termed it a pivotal element in the strong love affair between the Nixon administration and the Union, implying it was related to the 1972 election. The terms of his release, however, forbade Hoffa from engaging in direct or indirect management of a labor organization. Much as the Union wanted Hoffa out of prison, it stressed the mob did not want him in a position of Union leadership. The parole restriction had been bought, according to one rumor, with a $500,000 mob contribution to the president's re-election campaign, engineered by Anthony Provenzano, a Teamster leader in New Jersey and a capo regime in the Genovese family of La Cosa Nostra. Once out, Hoffa filed suit to declare the restriction invalid, and he began to make a move to regain the presidency of the Union. He sounded like a reformer, and one promise he made, if elected in 1976, ironically, was to end the Teamsters' relations with the mob. That praise went too far. It would lead to his murder. At about 1:15 p.m. on July 30, 1975, Hoffa left his Detroit home on Robson Drive to go to the Red Fox restaurant in Bloomfield, a suburb of Detroit, to meet with Anthony Provenzano and Anthony Giacalone, who was a caporegime in the Detroit La Cosa Nostra family. Hoffa arrived at the Red Fox about 2 in the afternoon. Neither Provenzano nor Giacalone were there. They would both subsequently establish their whereabouts elsewhere by airtight alibis. Hoffa was evidently picked up between 2:45 and 2:50 by Charles O'Brien, the son of Hoffa's one-time girl, Sylvia Pigano. According to one account, 2 men were in the car. One was Salvatore Briguglio, who served as business agent for Teamster Local 560, Provenzano's home local. Hoffa was probably knocked unconscious, which would explain why his hair particles and traces of his blood were found in the back seat of the maroon Mercury that O'Brien had borrowed from Giacalone's son, Joey. O'Brien had close ties to Giacalone when he called Uncle Tony. Indeed, O'Brien's mother, Sylvia, who died in 1970, had also been Giacalone's girlfriend. In addition, she had been a close friend of Hoffa's wife, Josephine, and it was rumored that the 2 men were double-dating Giacalone and Anthony Cimini, another mafia leader in the Detroit area, in the early 60s. According to that story, Hoffa had only been able to break up the affair by appealing directly to Joseph Zerilli, the La Cosa Nostra boss of Detroit. It has been suggested, on the other hand, that the hitmen were not with O'Brien in the car. Instead, Hoffa was driven to O'Brien's temporary residence 4 minutes from the Red Fox, waiting calmly at the house where Salvatore and Gabriel Briguglio and Anthony Cimini, another mafia leader in the Detroit area, in the early 60s. According to that story, Hoffa had only been able to break up the affair by appealing directly to Joseph Zerilli, the La Cosa Nostra boss of Detroit. It has been suggested, on the other hand, that the hitmen were not with O'Brien in the car. Instead, Hoffa was driven to O'Brien's temporary residence 4 minutes from the Red Fox, waiting calmly at the house where Salvatore and Gabriel Briguglio and Thomas Andretta were flown in on a private plane. There were also conflicting reports as to where Hoffa was killed. It may have been at the house where O'Brien was staying, but apparently unbeknownst to the people who lived there. In addition, there were contradictions as to how Hoffa's body was disposed of. One informant's story was that it was stuffed into a 55-gallon drum and shipped to a New Jersey dump. It was also reported that the facilities, shredder, compactor, and incinerator, of Central Sanitation Services in Hamtramck, Michigan were listed. According to other FBI informants, Central Sanitation Services, which was owned by Rafael Quasarano and Peter Vitale, two Detroit La Cosa Nostra members, had been used to dispose of at least 10 other bodies of mafia murder victims. Finally, there was disagreement over how much O'Brien knew or what his role was. O'Brien himself said, "I never did anything to hurt Jimmy Hoffa. What there was no disagreement about was, Hoffa was dead, and the mob was responsible for his death." The murder, however, was ultimately traced to Russell Bufalino of Pittston, Pennsylvania, a mafia leader for a large area of Pennsylvania and an Appalachian attendee in 1957. In addition to Bufalino, the finger pointed at Joseph Zerilli, as neither Provenzano nor Giacalone had the stature to order a hit on Hoffa in Zerilli's territory. Bufalino's involvement could be inferred from several factors. He had, for one thing, long been associated with both Provenzano and Giacalone. He had also been in telephone contact with Quasarano and Vitale in the months that immediately preceded Hoffa's disappearance, and he was close to his cousin, William Bufalino of Detroit, a former Hoffa attorney, who showed up to represent all of the suspects and their alibi with witnesses in a grand jury probe of Hoffa's disappearance. Finally, Frank Sheeran, the president of Teamster Local 326 in Delaware, who shepherded the alibi witnesses before the grand jury, was involved with Bufalino in a labor leasing scheme to circumvent wage provisions of the National Master Freight Agreement, which would have been in jeopardy had Hoffa returned to power. The motive. Hoffa's disappearance and death, however, needs to be placed in a broader perspective than concern that he might put an end to a labor leasing scheme. Before his death, Hoffa represented the mob's access to a source of wealth, the Teamsters Union Central States Pension Fund. As an FBI electronic surveillance conducted between 1961 and 1964 on the Home Juice Company of Detroit showed, Home Juice, a soft drink distributor, was owned by Anthony and Vito Giacalone. Hoffa was the mob's connection to the fund. According to Vito Giacalone, Mike Polizzi, a Detroit mob figure, had remarked that he would have never gotten his loan of $630,000 without Jimmy. The loan had been obtained through Sylvia O'Brien. Mike also said that Jimmy had to put his stamp on it in order to force these guys, the fund trustees, to give it to him. Several factors contributed to Hoffa's influence over the fund: a joint employer-union trusteeship for the employees, which was established in January 1955. The union had de facto control over the investment decisions made, as the employers did not want to antagonize Hoffa. In addition, the decision was made to invest the fund in assets directly and not to give its management over to professionals. Hoffa himself, therefore, became the controlling figure in the making of loans. Hoffa's chief advisor on pension loans was Alan Dorfman, the stepson of Paul Dorfman, through what Hoffa had established and maintained his Chicago mob connection. Paul Dorfman was one of the 5 or 6 closest associates of Anthony Accardo, one of Al Capone's successors in Chicago. When Hoffa went to prison in 1967, he told Fitzsimons that Alan speaks for me on all pension fund questions. Hoffa added, "He's the guy in charge while I'm gone." Dorfman, like Hoffa, has been successful in defeating several criminal prosecutions. He was found not guilty in Hoffa's Chattanooga jury tampering prosecution in 1967. He was also found not guilty in 1974 of embezzlement and mail fraud in connection with a fund loan of $1.4 million. Charged with him in the 1974 prosecution were Anthony Spilotro and Felix Aldericio, both Chicago mob figures, and Irwin Weiner, a Chicago bail bondsman long suspected of organized crime ties. On September 27, 1974, a witness in the embezzlement and mail fraud case, Daniel Seifert, was shot gun to death in front of his wife and 2-year-old son. Dorfman's won guilty verdict Carney in 1972 for conspiracy to take a $50,000 kickback for arranging a $1.5 million loan. The cross-examination by the prosecutor at Dorfman's trial established how little independence, judgment the fund's trustees exercised over loans or over Dorfman, then an employee of the fund. Dorfman was able to extract the $50,000 kickback by arguing that the fund had already lost so much money on outstanding $15 million loans to the borrower who paid the kickback, George Horvath, that a new one should cost Horvath the $50,000, $55,000. Although the Horvath kickback was Dorfman's only criminal conviction, there were organized crime overtones to pension fund loans he administered, particularly some in Las Vegas. Most pension funds tend to have a conservative policy, investing primarily in government bonds and having less than 2% of their assets in real estate. Yet by 1963, the Central States Fund, with accumulated assets of $213 million, had 63% of its investments in real estate and only 3% in government bonds, with the rest held in bank accounts and cooperate bonds. Fund loans included in 1959 and 1960 a series made to Morris Mo Dalitz, a gambler and former bootlegger from Cleveland, whom Hoffa had known in Detroit and through whom a payoff had been allegedly arranged to settle a Teamster laundry strike in 1949. The Dalitz loans were obtained to build Sunrise Hospital in Las Vegas, as well as to finance the Stardust Hotel and Country Club, the Fremont Hotel, and the Desert Inn, all in Las Vegas. According to FBI evidence, the Stardust, Fremont, and Desert Inn casinos were taking to the tune of $100,000 a month in the early 60s by a skim operation for the benefit of organized crime figures, including Sam Giancana of Chicago, John Scalish of Cleveland, and Meyer Lansky of Miami. Pension records showed that from 1965 to 1972, over $20 million was lent to Caesar's Palace, the ostensible owner of which was Jay Sarno, but who was really, according to the FBI, a front for organized crime interests in the Midwest and New England. Skimming was suspected at Caesar S. Palace, but not documented by the FBI. In 1971, on Dorfman's recommendation, fund assets were also put into the Circus Hotel and Casino. Loans of $15,000, $1,000 and $2 million were approved, the total figure finally reaching $26 million. Jay Sarno was again the paper owner, but the real party in interest, according to the FBI, was Anthony Spilotro, described by the Illinois Crime Investigation Commission as one of the most dangerous gang terrorists in the Chicago area. The FBI was also suspected skimming at the Circus Casino. In 1974, the fund also approved a $62,700,000 loan to the Argent Corporation, owned by Alan R. Glick, to purchase the Stardust and Tile Fremont 262 Glick, in turn, put Frank Rosenthal in charge of his gambling operations. Rosenthal, who was an associate of Spilotro and who was convicted in the 60s of bribing a college basketball player, proceeded to organize a sophisticated scheme to defraud the casinos and the state of Nevada of at least $20 million in 18 months, the largest known skim operation up until now. It has been estimated that if all the organized crime-connected loans since 1957 were added up, they would amount to $600 million out of approximately $1.2 billion that had been loaned by the Central States Pension Fund. At least $100 million has been lost in undercharged interest, and another $285 million has been lost in defaults. Indeed, the mismanagement of the fund was so bad that in 1974 it ceased making loans, and in 1979, under Labor Department pressure, the trustees resigned, and Central States Pension Fund was put into the hands of Equitable Life Assurance Society and Victor Palmiers and Company. The percentages of real estate loans dramatically shifted from a top-heavy 70% to about 30% by 1979. The cash return went up to more than 9% from 4%. If Hoffa's fate is put in the larger context of control over the fund, then Bufalino would not have stood alone as the responsible party. It would have been a matter for the Organized Crime Commission to pass on. The top underworld leaders had too much at stake to permit Hoffa to return to the presidency of the Teamsters on a reform ticket. It would have been, as Hoffa himself said of Robert Kennedy, "He's got to go.